We're here with Jefferson Williams going over some of these sediment slides to look at the Jerusalem quake and looking at the layers that were then deformed as a result of the Jerusalem quake in about 33 AD. And Jefferson's, of course, done a lot of work to help to identify where that occurs in the Dead Sea sediments. And so it's been a great time to get to spend with him here.
We're talking about earthquakes. The idea of earthquakes and biblical scholarship, I mean, the Bible itself is just full of references to earthquakes.
Yeah.
14 or 15.
At least, yeah. And, I mean, all the way back to, Jonathan with the Philistines and even prior, we have all of these incidents and these events that are kind of heralded by earthquakes. But you've done some work on Amos's quake, right, in 1560?
I wouldn't say seriously, but I've seen it in the field.
Mm-hmm. So you've seen the sediment that actually demonstrate that.
I do have samples from it that I can show you. Yeah, there's actually two. I think in the preamble to Amos, there's two sentences. It says he started preaching, I think, 2 years after the earthquake in Tekoa, which is near Bethlehem. So it only spoke of one. For a long time we thought there was one, but someone did some work on her PhD and she looked at it and she saw there were two. Mm-hmm. And for a long time the question was, we've got all this archaeological evidence that dates from around that time in northern Israel, but we also have it in southern Israel. And the earthquakes the faults are segmented, mm-hmm. and they don't appear to be capable of, that would have had to be an 8.5 to create that much damage. They don't appear to be capable of creating an 8.5, but what they do is they have couplets, and we found this, and this is the one I'm working on right now, mm-hmm. 749 AD. One earthquake will hit, and then in some cases 6 hours later in 363, and I think in 749, 15 hours later, another segment will hit. And it's called triggering, and when the earthquake moves, imagine all that earth moves. Now you got all this stress on a new segment, and it pops. Well, to a geologist, 6 hours or 15 years are both like that.
Right.
So the Amos quake, we see two quakes within a couple of decades of each other. And the fact that they're two now explains mm-hmm.
We
had another triggering event. Mm-hmm. I'd love to figure out if the southern one hit first or the northern one hit first. I'm pretty sure that the one that's mentioned in the Bible, which may be echoed later, I think in Isaiah. Was Isaiah after Amos?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think in other words, I think he may be describing it in an account and describing aspects of that quake, some stuff that went on Mount Olives and whatnot. I think it's in a prophetic vision, but there's elements that seem like he might have caught him from that because people, I'm sure, would have talked about it. It was a very big earthquake, but it probably was in the north.
Widespread destruction, right? That's why there's been the discussion of if the damage that they've seen archaeologically is a result of Assyrian conquests or if it's a result of earthquake. But
that's right.
It's so widespread that it looks more like earthquake than
that's one of the clues. That's right.
Like armies coming in and destroying cities and everything. Now, didn't that one, at least one of those quakes, had an epicenter in Lebanon, though, right?
Well, Steve Austin's paper, before he knew that there were two, mm-hmm. tried to figure out how you could get an earthquake that big, and there was a lot of damage up north. He stuck it in Lebanon and said it was an 8.5, and everybody who was a geologist working in the area said, we don't get 8.5s. Mm-hmm. We don't get anything bigger than 7.5. But the paper, this is why the most important part of the paper is the data, not the conclusions. Sure, the conclusions change over time.
Right.
And he collected a swath of data. He had all the archaeological data, but then he also mined the texts. And so eventually when Elisa Gagan saw that there were two earthquakes, all of a sudden what he showed got explained. Mm-hmm. And no, the epicenter does not look like it was Lebanon. The epicenter looks like it was south of the Dead Sea and north of the Dead Sea. I haven't done the work on it. Eventually I will. Mm-hmm. But it looks like that. It might have struck Sea of Galilee north. I don't know. I got to look at the sites. But it was north and south. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot of the ones we get. A lot of them are South Dead Sea. Mm-hmm. South of Dead Sea triggers a north of Dead Sea. Or in this case, north may be triggered south. But I don't think the south is the one in the Bible because the southern earthquakes hardly get reported.
Well, isn't that true for? I mean, when you look at your data, you see lots of earthquakes that don't have a correlation to a biblical story, right? I mean, there are earthquakes that
Or
are
a
not
historical
representative.
study.
Right, or historical. So it says that either they were not affecting a lot of people, or they
just
weren't important to the story that was the narrative that was being told.
Well, whatever there, people would talk about it, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
But whether it got written down and the writing got preserved extant, if it's in the south of the Dead Sea until about 1000 AD, it's unlikely that it would get reported. So I've seen there's an earthquake around 300, shows up in the archaeological remains of Isla, which is where Aqaba is, or Elat. So I'm talking AD right now.
Mm-hmm.
There's another one around 590 or so in Areopolis, Rabath, Moab. Also, no historical account, but there's an inscription that talks about we built this church after the earthquake. Capitolius Theater in northern Jordan in 250 AD had an earthquake. This was up north, but the historical record's very silent in the 200s. After Josephus, between 100 and 300, the historical record's very silent. You had all these Jewish revolts and a lot of depopulation, and nobody cared about this part of the world, and then all of a sudden Constantine converts to Christianity. Roman Empire patronizes Christianity. All of a sudden you have all these historical accounts that are getting preserved, and we have good records starting around 300.
Mm-hmm.
So there's those two. There's what's called the Incense Road Quake of the earth around 100 to 120 AD. Struck all from Petra to Gaza.
Oh.
No historical accounts. It may be alluded to in the Talmud associated with a seismic sea wave, but the passages are so ambiguous and so mystical. And
Right.
you know, there's a rabbi who goes out on a boat and there's a huge wave that shows up and he says, "Go down, wave," and God's on his side and the wave goes down. So this is not unusual for the accounts of this time, but it leaves you in the conundrum. Was he describing a tsunami there?
Right. Sounds like. But
It has echoes of a tsunami, and it's right around the right time. The rabbi died before the Kidos Revolt in 115 AD, just before it. It fits the timeline, but it's also ambiguous because he's not giving you information like this wave crashed on the shore and killed a bunch of people and sunk a bunch of ships or anything else, right? If I had it with that information, then I'd be on solid ground. When I just have him telling the wave to drop down, I don't know.
yeah. Well, and when we look at the biblical accounts, I mean, in particular in these early earthquakes, the 1010, so Jonathan's earthquake, and the one for Samuel, and then the one in Amos, that Amos recorded and everything, those have great significance for us because the Amos quake in particular, that's the introduction of this concept of the day of the Lord in the Bible. And in Amos's way of presenting it, where it is not where the Israelites are so excited for the day of the Lord, he says, you remember now the day of the Lord, that destruction comes not just for the Gentile, but for you, if you are unrighteous. And so that's what I like, looking at the context of that earthquake and its the broad range of the devastation, because prior to that time, the Israelites had never seen the day of the Lord as something that was going to bring judgment to them. It was always something that would bring judgment to their enemy, which is what you see with Jonathan.
Actually, you see that in all the literature. I see this in 749. You see, at that time, Christianity had all these schisms.
Mm-hmm.
And we have two accounts of the destruction of the church at Mabug. And in these two different accounts, one of them says it was one group and one of them says another group.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the split, I can't remember the names, but it's the split between what became the Eastern and Western Church, where the Western Church is the Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, and the Greek Orthodox Church. And the two authors say it was a different church, and coincidentally, it's the church opposite to their group. Mm-hmm. Right, and sometimes you could even see some glee on their part that the other partisans got
and
hit.
in that when that schism, the Great Schism, there was obviously a lot of that. There was, I mean, it was all you're the bad guys. It was pretty persistent through that whole period with the Pope and Orthodox Church and the disconnects.
Well,
there,
this is before the Great
challenges, so-
Schism. This is the schism that came out of the Council of Chalcedon,
Oh, Chalcedon. Okay.
an earlier schism. This
Well,
is
but
100
it's-
years
yeah.
after the Muslims showed up, and they had all this iconoclast fighting, but that Christianity had already split into Eastern and Western groups, like the Maronites of Lebanon are associated with the Catholic Church in Rome, and then there's the Syrian Orthodox Church, which is associated with Eastern churches.
And again, with it's interesting with those schisms and everything. Just a little bit of insight that even at Chalcedon, it still all goes back to the character of Christ. I mean, that's the
Yes.
continuing challenge. Is the character of Christ? Who is Christ? That creates all of the challenges and difficulties. In addition to that, then is of course the political power and everything. But there's always the central religious question is always the character and nature of Christ.
It seems amazing that was so worth arguing on, but I'm sure they'd look at what we argue about now,
Yeah.
1,000 years hence, and say, my God, you guys are arguing over trivia.
Well,
Right.
it's still the debate over the nature and character of Christ. It filters into everything. Now, some of the work that's gotten you the most critical attention, perhaps among other seismologists and other people involved in your work, is the 33 AD quake, right? And how that fits and everything. So, how did you come to spending the time that you did on the what is often called the Crucifixion quake now? So, where did that begin for you?
I work in the oil business. The oil business has booms and busts. My first business was going out in the field and helping people set up acoustic sounding operations in oil wells around the world. It was a great going concern in the 90s, and then the Asian currency crisis hit in 98, and the oil industry crashed, and my business went away. It took a couple of years, but I still had my last contract work in Egypt. And so I went back to graduate school, and I also decided to read the Bible. And I read the first 200 pages, and my eyes were glazing over with boredom. And I didn't pay attention, and I wasn't knowing what I was reading. So I went to the religious studies department of Cal State Long Beach, where I was doing the master's degree, and I bought 5 or 6 books on reading the Old Testament and cultural context and history. And I read those, and then I started reading again, and all of a sudden the Bible was alive and was much more interesting. So I read it and read it and read it, and after 9 months I got to the Gospel of Matthew, and I was still trying to figure out what exactly to do in grad school, and that night I read about paleoseismology. I had no idea that this existed, a branch of geology where you dig into the earth and you find the earthquakes and you radiocarbon dating and you figure out how big was the earthquake and when did it hit. And I thought, oh, I could combine that with soil mechanics, do something quantitative. And then the same night I read the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, and it says there was an earthquake. I went, oh my God, eureka, we could go figure that out. So actually I stopped reading the Bible at that point. I have since read the rest, but I actually stopped for a year or two. And I went and trained with the best paleoseismologists. Turns out they're all in Southern California. This is where that science began. Trained with Carrie C.
For
at
obvious
Caltech.
reasons, right?
Yeah. Because we don't have a historical record. We need to figure out what's called seismic hazard, how big an earthquake can hit here, especially when they were making nuclear power plants. So they funded this to figure out what's the biggest possible earthquake based on actual data. So Carrie C. at Caltech basically invented the field in 1978. So I trained with him and a guy named Tom Rockwell at San Diego State. I learned enough, and then I went to both of them and I said, hey, here's this earthquake. Most influential story in human history. You could go do some paleoseismology. Neither were interested at all. They were all busy on their own stuff. They were like, yeah, fine. So Rockwell, though, was just starting to work in Israel. The Israelis were bringing him in as a consultant to start paleoseismology over there. Paleoseismology was just starting in Israel. So Rockwell says, well, yeah, but you should talk to this guy, Ahmad Sagnan, in Jerusalem, because he's heading it up. So on one of my trips to Egypt, I was in Sinai, so I could just take a bus. I took a bus to Jerusalem. I visited Amat-Sagnan. I said, hey, is there an earthquake from around 1st century? And he goes, yeah, there's one in 33 AD. I was like, you got to be kidding me. So I went down to the Dead Sea, and I couldn't find it.
Yeah.
I still kept getting sent back to Egypt, so I went again, couldn't find it. Went a third time, kind of pushed a little bit. He sent his PhD student out there. She showed it to me. And so then I just started working on it and slowly started learning how to do paleoseismology in the Dead Sea.
Mm-hmm.
And I found out that their 33 AD, they didn't know it was 33 AD. Their date was between 10 and 50. They were just taking an earthquake catalog that said there was an earthquake in 33 AD and said, okay, that's it.
That's the one. Yeah.
And the catalog, all it said was temple shaking in Jerusalem slight. Didn't mention that it was from the Gospel of Matthew.
Sure.
Didn't mention anything. And so that was also my first introduction. Oh, these catalogs. First you just think, well, this is written by a historian, must be right. But I was like, gee, they sure did miss.
Mm-hmm.
This happens right after Jesus died. So I said, well, they must have I thought they must be some other information besides the Gospel of Matthew. So I looked at the earthquake catalog and said, where's the references? I went and found the references. Where's the references, right? And then I collected every earthquake catalog I could find and chased all the references back, and they were all the Gospel of Matthew. Every single account went back to the Gospel of Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
So this is how I eventually ended up writing an earthquake catalog, because I discovered, these catalogs aren't so great. They're too short.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they have, not this one, but other ones have errors that propagate through.
Mm-hmm.
So I just worked on it. First thing I did was work out the magnitude. Then later I got in contact with the Germans who were involved in the Dead Sea to work out the date.
Mm-hmm.
And what I was working out was the Jerusalem quake. That's the one in the sediments. And so I ended up dating that to 26 to 36. It struck in pilot train.
So when you say, when you look at the evidence, what specifically are you looking for in the Dead Sea? Because you're using the mud itself, right?
Yeah, you want me to show a sample?
We can do that, but
Okay.
As far as your...
So we have these flat-lying layers, and they'll be light and dark.
Mm-hmm.
And they're approximately annual, just one on top of the other, just nice, flat, beautiful layer cake. And then the top surface of the Dead Sea appears to deform during earthquakes. And so you'll see these deformed layers between the flat-lying layers. And if you look at the major deformed layers and look at your radiocarbon dating, and then you look at the reliable earthquakes out of the historical record, you'll find out, they correlate.
Mm-hmm.
So the Dead Sea is recording earthquakes. In fact, it's the greatest earthquake record in the world. It actually goes back 80,000 years, maybe not complete, but certainly in what to a geologist is modern times, we can definitely go back 5,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's recording all these earthquakes. So I look at those deformed layers, and then you get radiocarbon samples throughout. They give you dates. You go through a computer program, they get calibrated, they're all over the place. But if you get dense dating, all of a sudden that statistical cloud starts to tighten up. And if you have a good understanding of the historical record and can estimate the intensity, which is what I did first, right? The intensity of a deformed layer, and you kind of have an idea where the epicenter is, you can start correlating them.
Mm-hmm. Now, in addition to seeing the data that demonstrates a quake in 33 AD, you also found evidence for even the darkness that came after.
Well, I don't know.
Potentially.
I don't know if I found evidence for the darkness. I was, and still am, interested because that's the second physical observation on that day that the sun went dark for 3 hours. So it's not possible to be a solar eclipse.
Right.
It's actually a full moon. It's physically impossible. The moon's on the wrong side. and eclipses don't last for 3 hours. I had started working with a professor at Cambridge named Colin Humphreys, who he's the one who has kind of the go-to article in Nature in '82 that uses historical astronomy to figure out the year of the crucifixion, because the gospel writers didn't tell us the year. So he says most likely the year, he says, is 33. 30 is slightly less likely. And he had said to me, well, it could have been a dust storm. So I got this idea from him, so I said, all right, I'm going to start looking at dust layers. And the first thing I noticed when I started going back out in the field was a lot of these earthquakes do have dust layers on them.
Which makes sense, right? I mean, if you're talking about fractures and everything, we get the sand blows and everything.
Yeah, there's a dust cloud that appears to get kicked up by the earthquake in this dry area. But, of course, this is the mother of all dust storms that they're talking about. 3 hours blotting the sun out. That's a huge dust storm. So I also was interested in whether there was a big dust event. And I saw one in Engedi, a very dark layer. I eventually studied electron microscope at Colin Humphreys' lab in Cambridge. But it looked to be about 7 years later than this event. But, it's not going to stop me. It's because I have to consider the possibility that the events are chronologically misplaced, right? The first victim of textual and oral transmission is chronology. But then one day I was having problems, and I decided to trace out very detailed the top of the Jerusalem quake earthquake layer, and it one day ended up being 4 days. And I traced it out and I figured out what I wanted, but when I got to the end, 20 or so meters away, I found out that that dark layer that very much looks like dust was right on top of the Jerusalem quake. And I have an explanation, but it's completely untested. That maybe something got scraped or something, but it's who knows. But all of a sudden, I saw that and I said, okay, well, maybe there is a dust layer. The thing about a dust layer, let's say this happened, and there was a blotting out of the sun dust storm, which happens. You can find these on YouTube where the middle of the day goes pitch black. It creates a huge amount of dust, like snow drifts afterwards, and then it gets moved around. The Dead Sea is not a place that usually gets the dust storms. It's something more common when they happen that they're up in Jerusalem in the Judean hills. But they will eventually get washed down into the Dead Sea. So if you are looking for evidence of a dust storm, what you primarily want to do is you want to look where the rivers are, that they're dry rivers, right? Wadis or what we would call arroyos, right? Where they are that dump into the Dead Sea from the Jerusalem area. And that's generally the northern part of the Dead Sea. So if this is ever done for real, it would be a heck of a project. But you'd have to be looking at dust layers on top of this earthquake at multiple sites. Because you wouldn't have direct deposition. You'd have what's called rework deposition, dust that got deposited and moved, and that complicates things.
Certainly,
right?
Certainly. But there's, it's interesting that there's at least potential evidence that shows an event like the darkness after, and its association with an earthquake is scientifically reasonable, right? I mean,
it's possible. The other idea that I had about the darkness was, let's say I finally figured out the year of the earthquake, and I figured out the time of the season of the earthquake, and let's say it happened in the spring, right? I still don't know if that story's right. It's still not completely unanswered question. But if I found that there was a dust storm coincident with the earthquake, that's pretty good evidence that that story's right. And if I found that there's a dust storm separated by a few years from that earthquake, that's pretty good evidence that the chronological accounts got mixed. So ultimately, I thought was if I can find, if I can figure out that dust layer and its temporal relationship with this earthquake, I might actually be able to answer what I originally intended, which was, is this story correct?
Yeah. Is the Matthew story recorded in the physical evidence?
Yeah. Is he talking about events as they, more or less as they happened?
Now, when your work with earthquakes and everything, have you done anything in North America?
Just the training here, no.
Yeah.
Dead Sea Transform is my whole specialty. So.
Yeah. So would you say that after this work that you've done and everything, it puts you any closer personally to believing that biblical story relates a factual event, or are you still working towards that? When you begin with, that story happened, I'm going to go find the evidence, or did this story happen, let's go see if I can confirm it?
Well, my whole perspective the whole time has been, I wasn't there, I don't know the answer, and I'm a scientist. So I am just looking to figure out what the Earth says. And yeah, I would like, for that particular earthquake, I would like to know if that account is correct. But I don't presuppose it whatsoever. And in fact, I remember one day I was out in the field looking at that dust storm, and I was thinking too much about the biblical story, and I got completely confused. And at that point, that was when I remember I said to myself, listen, you need to throw the narrative away. Your job is to see what the Earth says, right? The narrative told you want to figure out the chronological relation between what looks to be a dust deposit and an earthquake. That's it. Forget the rest. And just try to figure out what the rocks are saying, because it's actually a very complicated story that I don't understand. And stop trying to fit them into any preconceived notions whatsoever. Just figure out that. So I've, in a sense, become divorced from the story in my scientific work, because I have to just look at the material evidence.
And that's an approach, I think, that that we would hope that more scientists and more people out looking for evidence and everything would take, of saying,
well, that's what you're supposed to do.
Right, it's what you're supposed to do, but we know that often, just like when you're talking about that, how that layer is described in the catalog, they'll talk about the destruction, the damage at Solomon's temple, or the damage at the at Herod's temple, but they won't identify it with Christ. Even though a 33 AD date, for most people, Christians, would imply, oh, this is the Quake.
Well, that whole catalog is that way, though.
But that's my point.
It's not just on that. That catalog is way too short. It's by Amiran et al. In '94. It has created so many mistakes in the archaeological and geologic literature, and every entry is like a sentence or two. There's great references in there, though. But it's just basically too short. This is why I don't believe in short earthquake catalogs. They keep the references, but burn them.
The filtering itself implies a bias. I mean, just what do you choose to put?
Well, no, I mean, actually, right? he listed it as a credible earthquake, and he listed the temple damage as credible. So I don't think it's actually a bias against the account. He just didn't tell you where it came from. And actually, it wasn't sourced. Its source was not the Gospel of Matthew. Its source was another earthquake catalog, right? Like one by Bailey Willis in 1928. And Bailey Willis copied it from a guy named Avranitakis in 1903. And Avranitakis, I think, copied it from a guy named Malay in 1858 or something like that, right? So when you get older, they'll have sometimes where they came from. Avranitakis, for instance, does say it came from Matthew. But a lot of times these scientists started just recounting what was said and not telling you the source or the context. And this is how the earthquake catalogs became error prone, because that's not the only story like that. I mean, look, every earthquake up to 1000 AD is written by a member of a church or a mosque, every single one.
Sure.
And history that they're writing is not history, it's moral teaching. And when they write about an earthquake, they're teaching you morals. And the one I'm dealing on right now, 749, at the end of the account with the Byzantine authors, the one of the earthquakes, a fissure opens up in Mesopotamia and a mule pops out and a female voice and speaks prophecy. And, you know, it's right in there. And all these accounts are full of this because this is the way the people thought. But the earthquake catalog took just the sort of material evidence information out and didn't have the rest. And you actually need the rest to sort of contextualize it because, you know, in 749 I have authors all over the map disagreeing with each other and whatnot, and I have to figure out what's right and what's wrong, how it agrees with archaeological evidence, geological evidence. I have to discard some data. And knowing the world that the authors lives in helps. Like in this earthquake, there's a bunch of people who take an account that in the Byzantine authors, they said happened in Syria, a landslide, and then the Syriac, the Eastern Church authors, they say that it happened on Mount Tabor. Well, I don't think it happened on Mount Tabor. I think that they're all talking about schisms in the church, and they think earthquakes are a result of sins by this time, right? Mm-hmm. That if we're sinning too much, the earthquakes. And Mount Tabor's a site, it's not listed, but it was the pilgrimage site for the Transfiguration. It was a very religiously significant site to them, and I'm sure they viewed Mount Tabor as the site where the Transfiguration is. There's no landslide evidence, dated landslide evidence, on Mount Tabor, and I think they took a landslide that happened in Syria and relocated it to Mount Tabor, because it doesn't fit. That account doesn't fit. That was an earthquake that happened around the Sea of Galilee, and there was another one in Syria north of Damascus. So it's actually important to get more information than just the earthquake material. It's important to try to understand who the authors are and include stuff that to a scientist, a lot of scientists would think is crazy. Like they're going to think, you know, Jesus dies, there's a beat, there's an earthquake, and then there's the zombie pericope, right, where people are coming out of tombs, and you know, and then all of a sudden the second earthquake, an angel appears. When you remove the information from that context, you actually end up, as a scientist, as a pure scientist, in studying historical archives, you actually lose some information. And people think it's scientific to do it, but it's actually unscientific because you're losing context. You don't, if I include it, doesn't mean I believe there was a talking mule, right? I don't think there was a talking mule. I'm not 100% certain, but I don't think so. But I think of it like, oh my God, these guys are all Greek. I'm like, this sounds like the oracles at Delphi, right? Like, oh, the Greek stuff stayed around for a long time, right? Even 749 AD, they're still having these female prophetesses speak about the future, right?
Well, when we look at, these, whether it's the Amos Quake or the Judea Quake, Qumran, or any of these others, it also helps us to put into context those earthquakes, because if we look at the Bible as then being a historically relevant record of these earthquakes, you can't help but then also look at Revelation about the earthquakes that are coming. Right? One of my favorite phrases, or actually favorite in an odd way, I guess, but talking about the islands fleeing and the mountains being no more, and that it would be an earthquake like no human has ever seen. This final earthquake that happens at Armageddon, that area is very earthquake prone, right? I mean, the area of Israel and Jerusalem, that area, there are a number of earthquakes, but not to that significance, right? It is an earthquake prone
It's
area.
very analogous to the San Andreas Fault here in California. In fact, there's 3 great strike slip faults where the earth shifts like this: New Zealand, California, and the Dead Sea Transform from Aqaba up to Antioch. So actually the training that I did in Southern California on the San Andreas Fault helped with what I was doing there, because it's the same type of geologic regime. It's just moving. In Israel it moves like this, and in California it moves like that. So yeah, it is definitely earthquake prone. It has moments when the Crusaders showed up, there were earthquakes every 20 years. The last big earthquake that has happened in the region, though, was 1927. So we're approaching 100 years without a significant earthquake. So sometimes it goes quiet, but the earth builds up stress. I mean, it's not going away. It's just a matter of when it starts slipping again.
So preparing. The next one will be potentially larger than those that have come for a while. Then, if it's like California, where we say it's been a long time, so it builds up those stresses, and then when it does go, it can be a lot of energy release.
Yeah, for instance, here in Southern California, we got into a pattern of every 20 years we had a major earthquake in Southern California. And the last one was 94, 2014. The last one was 26, 27 years ago, right? So we should be due. But I can tell you from my Israel work, no, we don't know.
Yeah.
It could be 100 years, and then, I mean, these things go into patterns sometimes, but the patterns never last. There's a pattern, and then there's a new pattern, and it's at a depth that we don't drill that deep. Our seismic doesn't really penetrate that deep. There are faults that we don't know about. The 94 Northridge quake wasn't a fault nobody knew about, called a blind thrust. We don't know the actual mechanics of what's going on. We use statistical methods to see patterns and whatnot and make predictions, but they're loose predictions.
So for you, what's next? You're preparing to go back to the Dead Sea?
I would like to go in February, but I don't know if I'm going to be ready, because I need to find 2 earthquakes I'm sure about that struck in the spring, and I'm being very thorough in creating this earthquake catalog. Right now I'm about 2 or 3 weeks away from completing the 749. That's one that I'm very interested in. And I'm working with a professor at Haifa who also wrote an earthquake catalog. And he's a GIS guy, just like me. So this is mapping software with a database. And we're going to do spatial analysis to try to figure out, because this was multiple earthquakes that got recorded as one big earthquake, but it was a couple of segments slipping. And we're going to try to figure out if we can sort it out spatially. And I don't know if I'll be ready by February to be able to say, oh yeah, 749 is there, and it looks like it struck in January, which would be fine. I have pollen in January, but then I need to find another earthquake as well. And so I need to keep moving up. And 749 has taken me 3 months. I've been working on this one earthquake just for 3 months, and working, I mean, I work until I get too sleepy, I go to bed, I wake up, and I work again. It's been a bunch of work. And actually, the later and later you get after 749, they become harder and harder to work on, because there's so much more evidence. There's so much more archaeological evidence. There's so much more historical evidence. The earlier earthquakes are easier because there's not so much evidence. There's not so much in the textual accounts. The archaeology is not as sure because, for instance, I told you the Incense Road earthquake around 110 AD. Well, the sites that were occupied, for the most part, that evidence was moved away. Right? They built on top of it and swept away the remains, and then they had another earthquake, and they rebuilt, and another earthquake. Well, by the time you get back there, just little hints of evidence. So as I keep getting younger, it becomes even more and more work. So I think what's going to happen is I'll have to go a year from February. Next September, I'm going to go to Kyrgyzstan and train with an archaeoseismologist there to learn how to examine ruins for earthquake evidence that helps me with this catalog. Because
So in addition to your movie, the Crucifixion Quake, it's on Prime, Amazon Prime, and is it any place else?
Tubi TV, you can see it for free with ads. Google Play, YouTube Movies. I think
Still no
there's
DVDs though, right?
no DVDs.
Okay. Do you have another project like that coming, or is that
A movie?
a earthquake movie, book, anything like that? Okay.
I have my earthquake catalog, which is online and free. DeadSeaQuake.info. I can't give you exactly a link, but if you search Fortress at Arad Quake, you'll see it, and there's a catalog home button.
Okay.
I think people will be
put a
bored
link on the site
to
there.
tears with this because there's no attempt. I have a site for the public at DeadSeaQuake.info that I've neglected. There's nothing really for the public. This is for the specialists, but some people may be interested. But, you know, I just tell it like it is and don't bother to explain some things in that catalog. Otherwise, it'd become super long.
Yeah.
And it's already long enough. So, FORTRESS space at space ARAD Quake, you can find it.
Okay, put a link up. Well, thank you for your time, Jefferson. Appreciate being with you here today. We're looking for evidence. We're always trying to build the evidence and the data that allows people that if they want to believe, they understand it's okay to believe. They're not an idiot if they believe what the Bible says about history.
Oh no, you're not an idiot.
So, thanks.
It's still, people are still trying to figure out what the evidence says in relation to the biblical stories, and there's a very healthy debate.
It's nice to
going on.
talk to somebody, though, who their assumptions don't prevent them from actually seeing the data. So, thank you.